Okay, how to choose Arba Minim, what are you looking for? Torah says, there's a mitzvah to take 4 species on the first day of Sukkot. The biblical mitzvah is on the first day. In the diaspora where we have 2 days Yom Tif, so the second day is also similar to the first day, and it's not biblical because the second day Yom Tif is rabbinic, but it's the rabbinic replica of the first day, which is a biblical mitzvah, and there's certain requirements of the 4 species that are only relevant in those first 2 days. And then there's an additional takana that we should take the lulav for the rest of the week, for the days of Chol HaMoed as well, obviously with the exception of Shabbos. So traditionally, there's a lot of significance placed in this mitzvah, even though with all mitzvahs, there is a concept of Zakeh Van Vehu, to do the mitzvah beautifully, to get a beautiful mezuzah, a beautiful tefillin, a beautiful tzitzis. But specifically when it comes to the mitzvah of Dalet Minim, which the Torah refers to esrog as creates hadar, the beautiful fruit. So there is an extra emphasis on doing it in a manner of beauty. Now, unfortunately, what often happens is that people assume that if you're buying a lulav and esrog from a pious-looking Jew, then that means it's kosher. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and that's not to blame the merchant. I don't know if it's possible for him to actually examine everyone, and we are each responsible to check when you're buying it that it's kosher and that it's mahudar. And sometimes, if you have a doubt, you might want to ask somebody who has more experience in choosing them. And also, not just that they're kosher, but that they are mahudar, that they are the best possible they can be, obviously depending on your budget and whatever it is, but it should be in the best way possible. In general, nowadays we're spoiled in that everybody has their own set, their own lulav. Didn't used to be that way. It used to be, you were lucky if one person in town, if there was one set for the town, and everybody made the bracha on that one. And that's perfectly legitimate. If for whatever reason your budget or your circumstances don't allow you to get a mahudadika set, then it's perfectly legitimate for you to make the bracha on somebody else's set. Wait till you get to shul, whatever it is. And obviously, specifically on the first 2 days, it's a matana minas Hadassim because it has to belong to you. So whoever owns the set will give it to you as a gift, with the stipulation that it's a gift on condition that you return it to them afterward. And therefore, for the moments that you're holding it, it actually belongs to you. And then you can make the bracha on the most beautiful esrog. And afterwards, you could use your own for Hallel and Hashanah and the sections of davening where we hold the lulav and esrog. Of course, that's what Chassidim always used to do, to bench on the Rebbe's lulav, which, of course, in addition to the beauty, it was also the sort of the spiritual beauty that it was the one that the Rebbe had made the bracha on. Okay, so when it comes to the esrog, so there is a lot of discussion in halacha about grafted esrogim, which on some level have been fused or mixed with lemons. I'm not any expert on the agricultural side of it, and amongst those who are, there's a lot of debate of exactly what does it mean to graft esrog, and whatever the case is, there are different communities that have different traditions about which pardesim, which esrog orchards are muchzak, are considered, assumed to be pure esrog without any bilti murka, without any grafting of other things. So, for example, there's certain people who will take only from certain orchards in Eretz Yisrael, only certain orchards in Morocco, etc. Now, in Chabad, there's a very strong tradition to take an esrog from Calabria. They are called Calabrian esrogim, which is a region in Italy. They're also called Yanav esrogim. If I'm not mistaken, Calabria is where they grow, and Yanav is the ports from which they are exported.
Geneva?
No, Geneva is in Switzerland. Maybe it's the same root of the word, but anyway, if you see anywhere referred to Calabrian esrogim, Yanav esrogim, sometimes it's called Ganav esrogim because they said a G instead of or whatever it is.
Is it translating to Genoa, Italy?
I'm really not sure. I could easily find out. I know a lot of people who go there every year, I have cousins who live in Italy who go there regularly, and their family in Italy. Anyway, so our strong tradition is to take from there for a number of reasons. Number one, it's our again, I don't know if I'm saying this in a specific order, but there are a couple of reasons why we take specifically from those esrogim. Number one is because those are our tradition is that those are esrogim are built in murkav, those are pure esrogim. Now that has come under question over the years because it used to be that it was all wild for centuries. Those esrogim were all growing wild. In the last number of decades, when it's become more commercialized with farmers throughout the year, etc. So then the question is like, is there actual supervision as to what they're doing or not doing? We'll talk about a possible solution to that in a moment. But the tradition of taking a Yanav esrog is very, very strong by Chabad, and there's stories, I don't remember the details, but how in the difficult years, the Rebbe risked his life and smuggled across borders to be able to bring a Yanav esrog back to, I assume, to Russia. And so it's a very strong emphasis on taking specifically Yanav esrog. Additionally, there's a tradition brought down from the Baal Shem Tov that when Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu to take an esrog, Moshe Rabbeinu sent malachim, he sent angels to travel to Italy and to bring the esrogim from Italy. And based on that tradition, that's an additional reason why we take the esrogim specifically from Italy. Now, the Rebbe, I believe the Rebbe initiated it, but be that as it may, the fact is that there are nowadays in Eretz Yisrael, in Kfar Chabad, a number of orchards which are full of esrogim, which are all planted from an original Yanav esrog, an esrog from Italy. Actually, I believe they took esrogim which the Rebbe himself used on Sukkot, and they took those seeds and replanted them in Eretz Yisrael and created those what's called the Kfar Chabad esrogim. And till today, many people, this is not just Chabad, thousands of people across Eretz Yisrael are makbid specifically to use esrogim that come from Kfar Chabad because those have the lineage all the way back to the Yanav esrogim. In fact, I remember personally, I was once in other words, in Chabad, there's a much stronger emphasis in other circles, but even in other circles, there are many who treat Yanav esrogim with extra care, or with extra preference, if you will. And I recall one time I was spending Sukkot in Antwerp in Belgium, and I don't remember if it was Chalamoy or the Yom Tov, I think it was Yom Tov, whatever it was. I was walking on Mitzrayim in the Diamond District, and on my way back from the Diamond District into sort of the Frum part of town, I was stopped right by the bridge. I was stopped by a Satmar Yid wearing a shtreimel, and he said, "Oh, do you have a Yanav esrog? I want to." Obviously, he couldn't say the bracha. He had already said the bracha on his own esrog, but he wanted to just have an opportunity to hold and do the nanuim to shake a Yanav esrog. Now, one of the virtues of taking the esrog from Kfar Chabad versus the one from Italy is that the ones from Kfar Chabad were taken a long time before there was. Those are from the 70s. I think it was before the controversy in recent years, which has become as to whether or not the ones from Italy are actually 100% reliable. So that's one virtue. Additionally, financially, it's much cheaper. I think, relatively, they're cheaper. You could get a very nice Kfar Chabad esrog probably for $60-$70, and to get a similar quality Yanav esrog would probably be $150 or so. So that's another virtue. However, the Rebbe does emphasize that there is a specific virtue to taking one specifically, not just that is from the zan, it's called not just from the species of the Yanav esrog, but actually one that grows in Italy. And I don't know if this is the only reason, but one of the reasons that the Rebbe says is because mishmane haaretz, the fats of the land, is zoetali shal yavan. The pasuk refers to the fat of the land. The Chazal say refers to Italy. And therefore, when it comes, we want to take a beautiful esrog, physical beauty and physical sort of health, fleshy, fruit. that is manifest more in Italy than in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore there is a specific mile in taking one that actually grew in Italy for the bracha. The Rebbe himself, if I'm not mistaken, made the bracha on the Yanava esrog and also did the Nanuim, just shook without the bracha on an esrog from Kfar Chabad. But be that as it may, the Chabad tradition is very particular, very strong that we should make the bracha on a Yanava esrog, and if not a Yanava esrog, then a Kfar Chabad esrog that is a quote unquote grandchild of the Yanava esrog. Now, some of the halachas of an esrog. So first of all, an esrog has to be yellow. And one of the psulim of the esrog is that if it's green, it's not kosher. And the reason it's not kosher is because it's not fully grown. It has to be a fully grown esrog. Now, in order for the esrog to be non-kosher because of its greenness, it would have to be that the entire esrog is a very dark green. If even a part of the esrog has started to yellow, then that is considered good enough that it's a kosher esrog. And so in practice, it's unusual, highly unusual. I haven't seen the market perhaps this year. It's early, so it's a little bit more on the green side. I don't know yet. But it's highly unusual that you'll have an esrog that the entire esrog is completely green. However, it's brought in Sefer Minhagim, and this is, I believe that it's based both in halachic authorities and also specifically al pi Kabbalah, that it's best to have a yellow esrog, and it says in Sefer Minhagim, Mara esrog tzarich li is gel. The color of the esrog has to be gel. Gel means yellow in Yiddish. Yeah, it's the same word. Yeah, Y-E-L, gel. Yeah, Y-E-L. So we do have a specific preference to have the esrog to be as yellow as possible. There are various tricks if you get your esrog in advance, and they're very and it's very green. There are tricks to get it to be yellow. One of the tricks that I've seen is that you put it on a bowl in a relatively warm place, surrounded by sweet apples, and the apple should be as close to it as possible without touching it. So put it very close. Make sure, I don't remember why, but for some reason it was very thing you can't touch. Maybe it was because it was a concern that it would get overripe and too soft. Whatever it was, supposedly that works. Another practical consideration is that we're going to discuss in a moment. Blemishes, different things on the esrog. Now, often when the esrog is green, you don't see those things, and then as it becomes more yellow, they become more discernible. So that's another thing you want to try. Another reason that you want to try and, if possible, find an esrog that's as yellow as possible, so you can see what's going on over there. Now, a pitum. So the thing is that if the esrog is chassid, if the esrog is missing any piece of it, it's not kosher. So if it has a hole, now it's unusual. It does happen that an esrog could have a hole. If it it comes in contact with something sharp or whatever it is. So there are a lot of halachas that pertain to holes in the esrog, and you should make sure your esrog doesn't have a hole. And if it does, then discuss it with the rabbi, because there's a number of concerns. It depends on the size of the hole, and if there's a piece of the esrog missing, then it's certainly a problem. Which, by the way, sometimes you have a piece of dirt in the esrog. We'll see soon about this coloring. Sometimes you have a piece of dirt in the esrog, and you're trying to determine whether or not it's a stain on the esrog or it's an external piece of dirt. So you want to rub it off, but you have to be very careful when you rub it off to do so gently, because if you do it too rough and you take off even a small piece of the esrog skin, then that could be a problem. So if you have a hole that there's something missing from the esrog, it's a problem. If you have a hole that's just a pierce with nothing missing, then it depends how deep the hole is, and that may or may not also be a problem. Now, so if the pitum is missing, that's also a piece of the esrog missing. Now the pitum, there's two parts to the pitum. I'm just looking for a picture. There's the on the top of the esrog, there's sort of a little wooden stem that protrudes, and on top of that, there's like a brownish colored. It's called the sheshanta, the crown. Right now, the sheshanta, the crown part of it, if that's missing, that does not disqualify the esrog. The question is, if the pitum, which is the sort of the woody stalk that protrudes off the top of the esrog, is missing, then it would not be kosher, and that's only for the first 2 days. For the rest of Sukkot, if your pitum falls off, it is kosher. Now it's unusual that the pitum, that the entire pitum should fall off without anything left. 1 second. And it seems to be machlokes that if a part of the pitum is left, if it's kosher or not. But certainly if the crown falls off the shishanta, it's certainly kosher. And also the ukutz is the stem on the bottom, which is where the esrog actually was connected to the tree. So that also, you have to have an ukutz. There has to be something there, but it could be very small. It doesn't have to be a long protrusion. As long as there's something there, it's kosher. Now, sorry? So this is the ukutz. This is the stem where it grows off the tree. And in this picture, he's showing you the pitum falling off. You have the pitum and the shishanta fell off over there. I'm not sure if this particular book has a clear picture of an esrog with a pitum. Now, often you see here this is a funny shaped esrog, but you see that the pitum is the green part protruding, and then the shishanta is the brown part on top.
Is that the stem that it grows from?
No, the stem that goes from is on the bottom. You can't see it in this picture. That's this one. Right? Now, but you may say, well, often you see that esrogim without the pitum. So the answer is that if the pitum fell off while it was still in the tree, so there's different opinions. Some say that the pitum has to actually fall off in the very, very early stages of its growth. But I believe that the widely accepted custom is that as long as the esrog fell off the pitum fell off while the esrog was still attached to the tree, then it's considered kosher. And often the Calabrian esrogim are like that. They have no pitum, and that's totally fine. Some have a personal preference to have with a pitum. Some authorities say there's a halachic preference. The Rebbe certainly, I don't know exactly, but certainly there were many years where the Rebbe used an esrog from Calabria without a pitum. And either way, it's certainly fine. Now, somebody with an experienced eye could look at it and tell you when the pitum fell off. Depending, like if it falls off while it's still growing, then the flesh around it will grow up a little bit and it will create sort of a little indent. But it might take a little bit of experience to be able to tell that. But that's as far as the pitum is concerned. Now, discoloring. So any discoloration of the esrog is a problem. Anything that's not a natural color. Practically speaking, what we paskin is that means if there's a black dot or a white dot, if it's black or white, it's a problem. And also we machmer, I think, for brown. Try to be for reddish brown. Now it depends where that spot is. There's basically we'll divide the esrog into two. There's the choitim, which literally means the nose of the esrog, which is the top. Usually it's approximately the top third of the esrog from where the esrog starts to go slanting upward toward the top, toward the pitum. So those sometimes it's less, especially the Calabrian esrogim are more usually flat on top than are the Moroccan and the Israeli esrogim. But anyway, that top slope, the slopey top part of the esrog, that is considered the choitim, and that's sort of more discernible, more obvious discernible, and therefore if there's any discoloration in that section, it disqualifies it. So what this is a very common problem, very common issue to be aware of before you pay for your esrog, to turn it around, look at the entire choitim of the esrog, and see, is there any black or white dots or even brown dots in that section of the esrog. Now, even if there is, it may still be kosher, depending on exactly how black or white it is, or is it, again, like I said before, is it actually a black part of the esrog, or is there some black dot of a piece of dirt that's sort of stuck to it, and it could come off if you rub it gently, etc. But I mean, you could ask the esrog merchant to help you determine. You could ask a rav, or you could just choose a different esrog. But that's something to be very careful of, that the esrog shouldn't have any black or white dots in that top section, in the slopey section on the top of the esrog. And even a single black dot in that section could disqualify the esrog. And that would be disqualified even for not just on the first days, but even during Chol Hamoed, during the last days of Sukkot. If it's lower down on the esrog, so then one black dot is okay. It's only disqualified if it has, and I'm forgetting right now if it's 2 or 3. It's 2 or 3 black dots. Let me just check here. 2. Yeah, it seems like it's 2. I'm pretty sure that it's 2 black dots. So if on the lower part of the esrog, if you have 1 black dot, it's okay. If you have 2, then it's a problem. I have in my head that I'm pretty sure. Anyway, whatever the case is, so that black dot. So sometimes you see, because we'll talk soon about the blethel, which is a different type of discoloration, which halachically is no problem at all. So if you, but you have to be careful. There shouldn't be any black dots. You have to look out for them. And often you see, oh, I have a beautiful esrog. There's not even a single blethel on it, which is a beautiful hidur. But there's not a single blethel, and there is 1 black dot on the top or 2 black dots somewhere else. Then it's a beautiful esrog, but it's not kosher. Okay. Then you have, so a blethel. The blethel, literally, the word blethel just means leaf. I think the reason why it's called a blethel is because it's a type of stain that usually happens during.
Comes off easily.
Blettlach don't come off.
It does come off.
No, blettlach, they do come off. I've never seen a blettel come off.
That's when the leaf sits on it when it's growing, right?
Yeah.
And then take it out, there's the little button.
Blettlach, I don't believe blettlach come off. They're caused from when there's a leaf sitting on the esrog during its growth, or a branch and then something touching it, and whether it blocks the sunlight or it causes a stain, whatever it is. Now those blettlach are usually like a beige color, usually they don't disqualify the esrog. Certainly if they're not raised, if they're flush with the level with the esrog, then certainly they're okay. And even if they protrude, sort of if they're actual bumps, I think it's machlokas. Usually they're okay, but again, if they're raised, I'm not sure how we paskin if it's actually a problem or not. But either way, it's certainly a hidur. It's certainly a beautification of the mitzvah to try and find the esrog with no blettlach, or with as little blettlach as possible. And here too, we have the same sort of hierarchy, that having a blettel on the top slopey part of the esrog is much more, quote, damaging than is having a blettel somewhere on the lower part of the esrog. Again, if the blettel is surface flush level with the rest of the esrog, then it's certainly, even if it's on the chotem, it's still kosher. I think that if it's a raised bump in more than either on the chotem and then the slope, or in more than one place, then it would be a problem. Anyway, now there's another type of discoloration of the esrog which comes from a lot of usage. As psuchus progresses and you're holding it a lot, and especially if you go on miftzayim and it gets handled a lot, it gets brown. That is not considered the discoloration of the esrog and does not disqualify it. And on the contrary, it's a beautification of the mitzvah, that more mitzvahs were done with it. It's a symptom of having more mitzvahs. It's being that the esrog was used even more for mitzvahs, so it's even more beautiful. Okay, let's move on to the lulav. The lulav. The lulav has to be, yes.
Go back to the esrog.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the ones nowadays, of course, they'll sell more of the pitumless esrog, and because it takes a very fine eye and experience to know whether it's kosher or not, I prefer to buy the one with the pitum.
Certainly,
That would be the easiest way to do it.
yeah, and that's if you trust the guy who's selling it to you and he tells you that he can tell you this is for sure kosher, then that's fine. But if you want If you want to be more certain, then that's certainly appropriate, yeah.
In terms of the shape, there is
I
a
didn't talk about it.
beautiful picture of a Chabad esrog in the book, The Four Species, all the illustrations. And it shows the gartel.
Yes. So then,
And the comment was, no one knows the source of that.
right. Yeah, in general, people also, I should mention, people also look, there's no halachic source for this, but people, it's called a nice giggle. People like to have an esrog in a nice shape. Now, halachically, the only shape of an esrog that will disqualify it is if it's either deformed in a weird
It's
shape,
totally
or if
round.
it's round. If it's ogul kakadar, if it's round, then it's disqualified. But other than that, it's kosher. However, people also look as a preference for a beautiful shape, which means that it's all neat and symmetrical and straight. And additionally, people have a thing to have an esrog with a gartel. That's sort of the inside, sometimes in the middle of the esrog, like what you would call around the waist of the esrog. There's a nice intrusion around the esrog, which gives the image of that gartel. So again, that's a preference that a lot of people have, which all adds to the beauty of the mitzvah. Okay. Let's move on to Lulav. So Lulav has to be kapis tomorrow. There's machlokes whether it has to be from a palm tree that actually grows dates or not. It has to be kapis. The leaves have to be together. It can't be spread out. So that's why we get those lulavs which are straight like a stick. It would have to, in order for it to be disqualified, it would have to be very strongly spread out, which is, at least nowadays, is very uncommon. Now, we'll talk soon about what are the things specifically to look for in a lulav. But nowadays on the market, certainly in America, there's basically more or less two types of lulavim. There's the generic ones, which, you take the common box with a whole bunch of them and you take them out until you find a nice one. You're looking for one that's very green, as straight as possible, making sure it's not split, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the best you can. Then there's what they call dairy lulavim, which usually nowadays they usually come individually wrapped in a special box with, very carefully prepackaged each lulav, and those are obviously a little bit more expensive. Now, so what are you looking for? So those are usually, again, they're more green, they're more straight, and more beautiful. Now, in practice, you want to make so the thing that there's what's called the tiyomis. The tiyomis is the middle leaf. The structure of that lulav is that there's the spine, and out of the spine are growing on either side leaves. Each of those leaves is really a double. It means that they're joined on the back. They're connected over here. As you take any leaf of the lulav and rip it off, you'll see that you could split it into two. That's how you make the rings, by taking those two parts. And I mean, you could make a ring with one part, but yeah. Now, if you follow it up, if you take apart the lulav, you follow it up to the tip of the spine, you'll see at the tip of the spine, there's one leaf that's growing upward. That leaf, it's called the middle leaf. It's usually the center. Yeah, it could be a little bit off. That doesn't matter. That middle leaf is called the tiyomis, and the middle leaf should not be split. Right. So, like I said, each leaf of the lulav has those two things. So you want to check the tip of the tiyomis to make sure that it's still intact. Now, the truth is that halachically speaking, as long as it's connected most of the way, in other words, even if it's split an inch or two, it's still going to be kosher. It only comes disqualified if it's split all the way down, or perhaps if it's split roiv. I forget now. I think there's two shiurim, a roiv and a tefach. But if it's just split a little bit, it doesn't really matter, as long as it's not called like it's called a hamnik, which basically means like a Y, right? So if you have the two edges here, he has a picture. You see over here, you have sometimes you'll have, I mean, it's rare to see this, but you will sometimes see the two halves of the leaf sort of mamish, not just being split, but actually sort of being bent out into opposite directions. Then it would be disqualified. But if it's just split a tiny little bit, it's okay. However, the minhag is to be makmid, if possible, that it should actually be completely intact without even a little bit of split. So when you're looking through the box of the lulavim over there, that's what you're looking for. One of the main things you're looking for is to try and make sure that the middle leaf, the tiyomis, is completely intact. Now, the truth is that even if it is split all the way down, it's still going to be kosher for Chol HaMoed. It's only for the first days that it has to be intact, strictly speaking, certainly. But halachically, it's perfectly okay if it's split after the first days of Sukkot. By the way, the same is true of an esrog without a pitum. If the pitum falls off after on Chol Hamoed, then it's still okay to use for the bracha. They're basically, but just to give you some frame of reference, there are numerous requirements for each of the species. Each one has its own full siman in Shulchan Aruch, and they're basically divided into two categories. One is because it says "Lokachtem lochem b'yom harishon," you have to take on the first day, and that word "lokachtem" that you should take can also be read as "lakicha tama," to take a complete. It should be complete. So any disqualification that is because it's not complete. For example, if it's split, or if the leaf is split, or if the pitum falls off, anything like that, is only by Yom Harishon. Lokachtem lochem b'yom harishon. It's only on the first day, or in Chutzlar it's the first 2 days, and therefore in Chol Hamoed it's not a concern. But then there are other things which are pre-etzhada that it's not considered beautiful. If it has, for example, if the esrog has a black dot, it's not beautiful. So that disqualifies even on the rest, because that's not an infringement on Lakicha Tama, it's an infringement on pre-etzhada, which is equal for all days of Sukkot. Okay, so that's the general rule, and you go through in Shulchan Aruch, and it says this is only the first day. This is, the fact that it has to belong to you, that's only on the first days, because the Kachtem Lachem, that it should belong to you, is only on the first days.
Why do people who go out with a lulav and esrog and have strangers bench lulav and esrog, why don't they say something about almanas lahachzir?
So they should, but if they just have it in mind, then that's good enough. Halachically speaking, just having it in mind is probably good enough. And on Chol Hamoed, it's not necessary. Some say that the Rebbe did, and it's unclear to me whether or not the Chabad custom is to do it all the days of Sukkot, but certainly halachically, there's no reason to do it on Chol Hamoed. Okay, now there's another thing called Lulav HaKofuf. Lulav HaKofuf means if it's bent, if the spine of the lulav is bent. And that's another thing, you're looking at the lulav to make sure it's straight. Now, halachically, unless it's mamash bent over, it's still going to be kosher. But ideally, you don't want it to be just straight-ish. You want it to be completely straight. However, that's if the spine is bent. Sometimes you have, and I'll show you a picture in a moment, sometimes you have the tip of the leaf, and the tip of the lulav is bent. That's called, they call that, it's called knaplach. Like the top of each leaf, instead of being straight pointy, it's a little bit bent. And some Rishonim, some poskim say prefer to have a lulav with knaplach for two reasons. First of all, this way it's much less likely to be split. You know that it's actually kept intact. And B, you also know that it's not niktam. One of the disqualifications of a lulav would be if the tip of the leaf, if the tip of the lulav was trimmed, if something cut off the very tip of the lulav. So if it's bent over like that, then you could see very obviously that nothing of it was missing. So here you see a picture of those knaplach. One second. Yeah, this is the pictures of the knaplach. So there you go.
Just the baby one above it.
I don't know.
How common it is to see that?
So knaplach are very common, and some people prefer to look for them. The Chabad tradition is brought in Sefer HaMinhagim is dafka to not have knaplach, to look that the leaves should be as straight and pointy at the top as possible. So, which is better? You go to the lulav market, and some people will be specifically looking for one with knaplach, and some people will be specifically looking for one without knaplach, and it just depends on your particular tradition. Again, the Chabad tradition is to not have knaplach. Now, there's another thing called kara. Kara is the brown mach. It's called mach, called kara. That's the brown thing that grows on top of the lulav. Here you see a picture of it. You see that? Now again, there's some say that there is value to have the kara on it, because that way, if it's intact with the kara, then chances are there's nothing tipped off and there's nothing snipped off on the top, and it's going to be intact, etc., etc. There's also people who are against using the kara because, again, there may be more reasons specifically to have kara. There's two reasons that are brought that I know of not to have kara. One is because you can't really know what's going on underneath. it's unlikely to be split, but it's possible to be split, and you can't examine it. It's possible that it has kneplach, and if you don't want kneplach, then you need to be able to see under the kara. Another problem with the kara is that the kara sort of binds the lulav together. As the kara comes off, the leaves become more loose and wavy. Now, one of the very important things of the lulav is not just holding it, but the nanuim, that it shakes. And you shake it, the leaves are supposed to rustle a little bit, and that's especially true on Hoshana Rabbah. That's why on Hoshana Rabbah, before Hallel, we take off the two rings that are underneath, that are just binding the lulav. We take them off. Why do you take them off? Because you want it to be extra wavy, the nanuim. So that's a problem when you have the kara, that it doesn't wave. It holds it all intact. L'maisa, the Chabad tradition is. I don't believe this is an official Chabad tradition. It's not mentioned in Sefer Minhagim, but nevertheless, I think it's also the Sephardic tradition, but certainly the tradition, I believe, by the Rabbeim was to prefer a lulav with the mach. I don't know what they do, what the answer is. Like, what do you do? What do you do about the nanuim? Usually, by the time you get to Hoshana Rabbah, there's not much mach left over there, and it's going to wave. But even for the first days of Sukkot, maybe perhaps if you break down if there's no kara on the lower leaves, so then you have the nanuim with the lower leaves. It's unclear to me exactly, but that is our tradition. And here again, when you look at those more expensive, the dairy lulav and the prepackaged ones, so there's two types. There are the prepackaged dairy lulav with mach and without mach, right? And there's some people who are going to be specifically looking for the ones with mach, and some who are going to be specifically looking for the ones without. And again, Chabad custom is to look with mach. If you want to make sure that there's no kneplach, so if you look at, usually if the top leaf has a knepel, if the top leaf is bent over a little bit, then the lower leaves, the tip of the lower leaves is also not going to be so pointy. So if you get a lulav and you can see that the lower leaves are very straight and pointy, then chances are that the top leaf under the kara is also going to be completely straight. Yeah,
An analogy to that would be eating corn. When you're peeling the corn, many times there's left a leaf or so that clings to the corn. But when you lift that leaf, you find things that you don't want to see. So that's in the support of those who say without mach.
Right.
Our tradition has been through Rabbi, all the way to Rabbi Jacobson, who was the one who brought for the Rebbe with mach.
Right. Okay. Moving on to the Hadassim. Now, Hadassim is a very, they are problematic. In other words, don't assume that the Hadassim that you buy are kosher. Check them. You must check them. In fact, this year there's this whole scandal going on. There's a video making its rounds on social media of some place in Israel which has a hechsher that all the Hadassim are examined by God-fearing Jews, and then there's a video of a whole bunch of Arabs packing them. Whatever the case is, I don't know. I don't know where that video is from, and
there
if
are
it's
many who changed their Hadassim.
one moment. The Lamaisa, you have to check. You have to check the Hadassim. What are you checking for? So you're checking mainly for two things. First of all, you want to make sure that the top is not trimmed off. If the top is trimmed off, it's not kosher. So you could see, just by examining it, you could see how, it's very obvious to see what, if a hadas is trimmed, it's quite obvious to tell. Now, the other thing is that the hadas has to be mashulish. Mashulish means that all three of, it's called a kan. A kan is a set of three leaves that grow from around, around the twig. So all three of them have to protrude at exactly level, right? If you have two protruding on the same level and one protruding a little lower or a little higher, then that's no good. Now, so one second, let's see exactly what. Now, basically the way it works is the hadas grows. So at the top of the hadas, the top few bunches, the top few kinim are always going to be under a level. Then as you go further down the branch and they've grown bigger and the twig is thicker, etc., it's going to become out of sync and there's no longer going to be three all in an equal row. So ideally, lachatchila, the best way possible is to have 3 tfachim of hadas. 3 tfachim it's 24 centimeters, approximately 9.5 inches. You want to, ideally, the best way possible is to have that the entire top 9.5 inches of the hadas should be mashulish, should be that all of them are coming out at the same spot. Now, the basic hadassim that are quote unquote included in your set, they're not going to have that. If you want to get that, you have to buy sort of separately the more expensive hadassim. It's kosher if the majority of the kinim in that area are mashulish. Let me first show you a picture. Look, so there's actually 1 second. I mean, here, if you can see these pictures, 10 and 11, you'll see that 10 is they're all coming out equal, and 11 you can see one of them is a little bit higher. Yeah. So this is the way it's good that they're all coming out on the same exact spot. There's a question of how equal it has to be. Here you have a picture.
Most of them on the lower levels are 2 and 1.
Yes. If you look here, this one, they're not exactly level, but they're all that red line does sort of touch a part of the stem of each of the leaves. So the Chazon Ish holds that that's also called mashulish. Be that as it may, you need to have you have to have that the majority of the leaves are mashulish. Not the majority of the leaves of the whole stalk, but the majority of the leaves of the requirement of 3 tefachim, starting from the top down. Now here we have a big kula of the Alter Rebbe that many poskim hold that it has to be the majority of the area. So that means 3 tefachim is the minimum requirement. So you need to have more than a tefach and a half that the leaves of mashulish. The simple reading of the Alter Rebbe is that he's more lenient than that, and he holds that it doesn't need to be more than a tefach and a half. It has to be the majority of the leaves. Now, as the higher you go on the stalk of the hadas, the closer together are the things. So in the top third, let's say in the top 1 tefach of the hadas, you might have as many stalks and leaves, stems and leaves, as you have in the bottom 2 tefach, because as you go lower down, as the hadas grows, they become further apart from each other. So for those following the Alter Rebbe, that's a leniency which makes much more of the Hadassim kosher according to the Alter Rebbe. I've seen, I check Hadassim. I've had years when I've checked Hadassim for many people, and very often I've seen Hadassim which, without that kula of the Alter Rebbe, would be very problematic. Some say also that the leaves every leaf should be tall enough to touch the bottom of the leaf on top of it. Usually that's the case anyway. Yeah. So if you, okay. So the Chabad custom is actually to make sure to have more than 3 hadassim. The minimum requirement is 1 lulav, 1 esrog, 3 hadassim, and 2 aravis. The Chabad custom is already the Rambam talks about this. The Chabad custom is to have more hadassim. How many more? So as many. There's certain specific numbers that you're supposed to avoid. They're listed in Sefer Menhagim. Ideally, we get numbers that are divisible by 3. Because our custom is to set up the lulav in a way that you have a third of the hadassim on the right, a third on the left, and a third on the top. When you set it up, so you got 6, you got 12. The Rebbe used to have 36. Now we'll talk about the aravis in a moment. But one virtue to having many hadassim, in addition to the value in and of itself of having more hadassim, is that it helps maintain the freshness of the aravis. So that's sort of a side benefit that the aravis remain fresher when they're surrounded by more hadassim. So you don't need to. What I try to do, at least 3 out of however many hadassim I'm going to have, I want to make sure that at least 3 of them have the hatchila requirement that the entire 3 tefachim. But sometimes it's very expensive. I think last year I had to pay like $25 or $30 for 3 stalks of hadassim, which had the entire 3 tefachim completely mashulish. So, but you could have check the hadassim. That's the main thing. Check them, and at least a tefach and at least the majority of the 3 tefachim should be mashulish. Now
From the top
down, exactly. The aravis, again, basically the aravis, the stalks have to be red, but in practice, you don't have to have all the stalks being red. it's ideal to try and find some redness somewhere on the stalk. So, the aravas that grow in Europe are beautiful dark green leaves with bright red stalks. In America, you don't really find that. But there should be some redness to the stalk. That's a requirement of the aravas. Of course, the tip has to be not trimmed off. Now, usually often on the top of the aravas, at the tip, there's like these very small baby leaves. Some people have a preference to have those leaves there, but if those leaves come off, it doesn't matter as long as the tip of the twig is intact. And also you need to have the majority of the leaves of the aravas. Now, of all the 4 species, the aravas usually or often you will have to change them in the middle of Sukkot because either the leaves are becoming too dried out or a lot of the leaves have fallen off. They fall off very easily, especially if you have those baskets. We have the rings, so it's easier if you have the baskets, they push them in. In general, if you have the baskets, when you put in the Hadassim and the aravas, you want to sort of squeeze the basket to open up the hole so that you're not ripping off the leaves as you're putting the Hadassim and the aravas in them. I don't know if the reason why Chabad don't do that basket is for this concern, or if there's another reason. For whatever reason, our minhag of having.
What was the reason?
I don't know why we don't have it, but certainly one benefit of not having the basket is that we don't.
I still don't know.
Certainly a benefit. Again, I don't know if this is the reason, but there's certainly a strong benefit is that you don't risk pulling off the leaves when you put them into the basket. But keep an eye on your. Everybody has their way of keeping. You put it in a vase with some water. You wrap it with a little bit of a damp cloth. Whatever your preference of how you store your lulav is. Keep an eye on them and check your aravas, and most likely, and here, especially Rogers Park, it's very easy to find aravas. Go to Kasha Stam and Chalamoyed. It's very likely that you'll have to, change them. The arava, even if you don't have to, it's customary. It's brought in Sefer Minhagim. It's customary to change them on Chalamoyed to have them be more fresh. Even if they're still gone, they're not as fresh as they were in the beginning. Now you also have to make sure that you have the majority of the leaves. Now, another specific custom is that the Hadassim be longer than the aravas. We're trying to somewhat camouflage the aravas. So you have many Hadassim that camouflages it, but also in the height, right? So if you have the baskets, you have the Hadassim on the right, the aravas on the left, whatever it is. So you see them both. But the way we do it is we put the lulav down on the table, and you put the aravas immediately next to it, and then you wrap it around with the Hadassim and you put the rings. So you try to camouflage it. And what you do is you trim the aravas down a little bit. Obviously, they still have to have their requisite shear. But you trim them down from the bottom. If you trim it from the top, you've snipped the top, then it's going to disqualify it. You trim it down from the bottom so that the Hadassim should be taller than the aravas. Another important thing to be careful of when you're preparing your thing is that the spine of the lulav has to protrude a tefach beyond the Hadassim and the aravas. Now, again, a hadas has to be 3 tefachim, which is, I don't know, it's small, 10 inches like this. In practice, usually Hadassim are 5 tefachim or 6 tefachim, right? Now, you could trim them down, again, trim from the bottom. But whatever you do, you have to make sure, and this is even more problematic when you have a basket, which often moves upwards. So you have to really make sure that it's all the way at the bottom when you when you're holding it, is that the spine of the lulav has to protrude a tefach beyond the Hadassim. Now, the lulav itself usually protrudes at least a tefach, if not more, beyond the spine, right? The spine of the lulav comes to here, and then there's the leaf that comes all the way out of the spine. So in practice, again, every lulav is different, but in practice, your lulav has to protrude probably about, 13, 14, 15 inches beyond, is that true? Yeah. No, 12, 13 inches, probably. Hold on. No, that's 10 inches, whatever it is, beyond the Hadassim in order for the spine. It's very obvious to see. You look at it. It's very obvious to see where the spine of the lulav ends, and you want to make sure that between the tip of the Hadassim and the aravas and the edge of that spine is at least a tefach, which is 8 centimeters, whatever that is, about 3 inches. So you're gonna have another. I'm exaggerating. It's not 13. Yeah, it's usually gonna be 6, 7, 8 inches from the tip of the Hadassim till the tip of the lulav at least. And usually it's going to be fine. There's also a preference. Like some people don't like to have a very tall lulav and they'll want to trim down the lulav, which is totally fine. You trim it from the bottom, it's fine. As long as you have the requisite shear that the hadassim and the arobis are 3 tefachim and the spine of the lulav protrudes a tefach beyond that, that's okay. Just one more thing I'll mention is that also when you're holding the lulav and esrog throughout, so whether it's halal, hishaynus, whatever it is, as much as possible, you should always be careful to hold it with 2 hands. So hishaynus, if you're able to have the card and you balance it between your fingers, if you could just repeat from the chazan. If you can't, you can't. Whatever, some people hold the siddur, you hold it like this, that's also fine. Ideally, whenever you're holding in the lulav and esrog, it should always be in 2 different hands. And if you're going on mivtzoim, also be careful. If somebody has something in their hand, they should put it down. Or if not, you give them the lulav, take it back, and then you give them the esrog. But you never give them the lulav and esrog to hold in one hand. Let's see if there's anything important we skipped. I hope not. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I know Shana Rabbah, when you're buying the Hoshanas, some people use those Hoshanas to change their on the lulav. Are there Hadurim on the Hoshanas themselves? They're usually much bigger, and I don't think they're with all the Hadurim of
I'm not aware. I mean, again, if they're too, they could be too big. You want to make sure they're not that the spine of the lulav is still protruding a tefach beyond them. Okay, any questions before we close out?
When do you typically order your lulav in your restaurant?
It depends where you're buying it from. I mean, there's Rabbi Gurevich. I believe he's the only Chabad. I get it. Somebody gets a friend of mine gets them from me in New York. But the Rabbi Gurevich, I don't know if he still has or if he's closed already. If he's still taking orders, do you know?
No, I just looked at it when I was getting mine.
Do you know if he's still taking orders?
That I don't know.
I don't know, I have to.
And there's also, I mean, there's many throughout. There's Kashastam. There's all the throughout. I know there's Rabbi Reisman sells, and sorry, Yochanan doesn't do it anymore. There's Rabbi Reisman who does it in the Wi-Fi building. I don't know for sure that he